Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Talking with Tech Leaders. On this episode, we are joined by Dwayne Pascal, CPTO, Chief Product Technology Officer at Flatfair. Dwayne has decades of experience in software engineering and in product. And on this episode, we're talking about the intersection between product and engineering. So it's awesome to have Dwayne on in part one through his career, part two talking about product and engineering, how they intersect, and in part three some personal questions. So sit back and enjoy. I'm joined today on Talking with Tech Leaders with Dwayne Pascal, Head of Product Engineering at Flatfair. How are you doing, Dwayne? You well?
Doing very good, thank you. How are you doing, Michael?
Good, yes, not bad. And on today's episode, we've obviously got a kind of flavour for it, which is going to be the intersection between product and engineering, which we'll kind of talk about in part two. But in part one, it's all about you and your career, how you got to where you are at the moment. Do you want to kick us off with academia, school time?
Ooh, academia, school time. That goes back a ways for me. So I'm not going to give away my age if I talk too much about sort of what was happening around the time I was in university, perhaps. But yeah, so it was interesting. I think I probably when I was in like high school, I actually wanted to be like an astrophysicist at first. And then I was like,
awesome.
Thinking, I liked sci-fi, I liked space. I actually enjoyed, physics and, reading about sort of, time and these kind of things. Mm-hmm. But then I think as I got a little bit older and, the thoughts of where university might lead to in terms of job prospects, I sort of gravitated towards computer science. I have a brother who was in doing computing, and he was 4 years, and I saw what he was doing, and that sounded interesting. And so I actually ended up going to the same University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, and that's where I studied my computer undergraduate, and then went from there, and started work after that. And that was kind of the mid '90s, really. So I'll give away a little bit of my age there.
Awesome. And I mean, it's so interesting, obviously, school time and high school and going to kind of university leads you on that kind of career path into technology. Did you know quite early on during your degree, you thought this is it, I'm really enjoying this? Was there any kind of eureka moments for you?
I don't know if there was sort of specific eureka moments. I always enjoyed, I think, the problem solving aspects of engineering. The way I often described sort of programming in general, and what that's mainly what I was doing was looking at, taking something apart and rebuilding it or building something up from scratch. And I think that's probably not, unique to people in engineering. They like to build, they like to sort of, construct things, and problem solving is a big part of that. And trying to understand, I think the more I got into, computer science as my degree, I certainly found it interesting to look at the fundamentals of how do you build good programs, how do you make an impact for people, really, too. That's always been one of the underlying things that has driven me forward, is just the way technology and people kind of interact and that overlap between the two.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I suppose it's quite crazy to look, when you started working with technology, to where we are now, and that kind of time frame of what's possible and what you're working with at the moment,
Yeah, I remember. So it was probably like, one of my first graduate roles. I was working for a telecoms company in Canada. And, I remember around the time looking at something and going, what is this, World Wide Web server, www server, HTTP protocols that were sort of being talked about in some of the things at the time, news groups, which they were called at the time, and looking at that and sort of just trying some things out on my own, and had a little web server up and running inside my company. And I was one of the first people in the organization to really try it out. So I was showing people in my team, I was saying like, oh, look, here's what you could do. You could have this web server, and you could interact with it. You can have these links, and it's really an interesting way to sort of feed information, through. And I actually connected it into a bit of our code base to play around with things. So you could actually kind of maybe browse code in a browser or something like that. It was kind of really clunky the way I did it, but it was just kind of fun to play around with. Yeah. But at that time, I was thinking, this could be something that's that could really expand. Never foresaw, of course, where it was going, and you certainly never thought about things that people would one day be doing, like banking transactions and these kind of things. Those days, it was sort of so far out in terms of what you would actually need to do to accomplish that securely and safely, that it was just, certainly in my mind wasn't something that I had actually predicted. I'd like to be able to say I had the kind of prescience to be able to see where that was all going, but it was interesting to be involved in those kind of early stages anyway.
Oh, I can imagine, yeah. I mean, did you purchase any domains then off the back of working on the web and web servers and think, right, this could be something big?
Yeah. You know what? I've got a few that over the years, probably earlier on more than others, that I've purchased every now and then. You thought, oh, this is a good idea. I wonder if that domain name's available, and so you look it up and you find a domain name that's available for things. Yeah. So I've got a couple, I'm trying to think if there's any that I should do. They're all going to be really big ideas, of course. They're still waiting to come out, right? So exactly. I don't know if I can really disclose them yet.
No, I hear you. That's awesome. It's always something I think of when people kind of going through that time when you had access to, all of them really, So it was Nortel Networks that you joined after university, and you spent 11 years there, and that was kind of your graduate scheme, over that time?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate in my university. They had what's called a co-op program. And so at the time, what they did is, while you were in school, you would get this newspaper, which was filled with student ads that of employers that wanted to hire you. And, you would just basically submit top 10 of here's the ads, here's the jobs I want to apply for. You'd submit that into the university, and the university would then send your CV, your marks, whatever, documentation out to the employers. And then there would be, I think about 2 or 3 weeks of what they call like interview weeks during the middle of the term, where basically all the employers came into campus and you would see your name on a list for an interview. You would go to the interview. So so it was all timed so that, within a month of, for your term, you had a job lined up that you were going to, and it was all coordinated with the school, and you did a little report at the end of your work period back to the school. So the benefit of that is, like, while I did my degree, I think I did it over 5 years total from one end to the end. Yeah. It was always back to back with work and school. And so you did a 4-year degree over 5 years, but you come out with 2 years of work experience, if that makes sense.
Well, it's a big plus, isn't it? For some companies wanting that commercial experience, which is sometimes the blocker just now.
Yeah, and it was interesting because even at the time, because people were going, even some of the students were going into places like Microsoft at the time, or these other places where people are doing maybe more advanced research, or working with the edge of like different programming languages or new technology and tools, right? So even in classroom, you'd come back and somebody would be explaining something, or the professor would be talking about some way of doing things, and somebody would be able to raise their hand and say, "Oh, I was working on something like that, last term, and here's the way we used it," or here's what's changed in the recent update, and somebody be able to go, "Oh, that's great, now we know." So it's a bit of shared knowledge going back and forth. So I think it was a great place to be at the time, and certainly learned a lot through the process, and even just understanding from a personal perspective what kind of jobs are available. As a young person, and I've got kids that are going into university now, and I think for them, trying to kind of understand what their jobs are going to be like that they might get is always really hard. Like, what is it actually going to feel like when you're there on a day-by-day basis? And so, excuse me, I think that when you see that and get to work with that, earlier on, then you sort of get a taster for it. You can better decide sort of if it's the kind of career you want to take on going forward. Yeah,
no, completely. I mean, like you're saying, people kind of leave in university, taking that knowledge into the workplace and say, well, we learned this in academia and implement it into work, and that feeds through. But what you're saying is, you're actually taking things back and forth, and you take things back from work into university and say, well, this is what it's like learning to drive a car. They show you how to pass the test, then when you actually learn to drive the car, you're driving the car. I mean, it's going to taking it back and forth, so that's really interesting.
Yeah. And in the end, just to go back into the role I ended up taking on, was one that I was doing as a student. They liked the work I was doing, and they went, so it was, even by the time I had gone back for my final term, they had already basically said, well, we're going to offer you a job at the end of it. So it was nice to sort of go in with that kind of security as well too. So
yeah, no, that's amazing. And I mean, it was obviously a company you enjoyed. You were there for a decade, so yeah. Overall, it was it was different, and even in that time, I got to be involved with some interesting projects. So at the time that I went in there, I don't know, people will have a hard time imagining now, but there was like telecommunications was specifically custom built hardware, and they had rooms and cabinets full of equipment that was all sort of custom built hardware.
and we were initially doing programming on on a mainframe for those kind of systems. Mm-hmm. And even in the time frame that I was there, we were rewriting one of the projects I got involved with from the beginning was rewriting one of those entire systems, but just on a kind of standard Unix TCP/IP platform, using C++, and it was at the time it was really good project to be involved with, and then an opportunity you realize only later on, where you get to really be involved in kind of the greenfield development of something. And a lot of times in computing, you're coming into companies or projects where there's already an existing kind of code base to work with, existing product to work with, and you're trying to sort of both reverse engineer what's there while figuring out how to kind of build things forward. And this was a really nice time to sort of get involved from like almost day one for this particular project and help build it up and understand from scratch not only how to build it, but also how we looked at deployment, how do we get it out how do we ship it to customers, how do we operationally support the product, these kind of things as well too. So all the whole aspects we had to look at almost from scratch, really, which was really exciting part to be.
It's also very exciting. I mean, one of the things I suppose is interesting is the greenfield, brownfield stuff, and having like legacy or applications that are already in place and navigating around them, the dominoes, you knock something over if it's really old. But then I suppose with the greenfield stuff, it's great. But is it difficult to balance the want and the need versus, like it'd be great to have all these things and not get too ahead of it all?
It is. And it's one of the things I think you look at relatively early on is, trying to break down the problem into really fundamental bits really early on. And it's, some of the things that have come into things like agile practices now, but I mean, certainly, like you said, you've got to be really conscious of the fact especially when you're taking something that already exists and you're trying to look at building a kind of a newer version of it, not wanting to take kind of the wish list and not also taking all the baggage with things too, right? So trying to take it really from afresh and going, what do we really need to build for this? And how do we expect it to work? And how do we want to kind of add in the components that we think are going to be most valuable, as opposed to just taking it like for like, or like you said, or just going through a wish list of kind of things without necessarily assessing what's going to be most valuable to the organization and to the customers at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. So it was, there was, I think one of the things that helped is, you still needed to keep, costs under control. And so there was definitely a kind of, well, let's do X first, and then we'll build from there and do Y, and then we'll build on it. So I think because you're trying to do that, improve the concepts and make sure that things are working to sort of almost get those proof points as you build along, then I think that's one of the things that helped us sort of really build it up gradually and not get too complicated early on.
Mm-hmm. That was really interesting. Obviously a really good kind of foundation structure for the rest of your career, kind of working on different projects, with different engineers, the project management side, and I suppose budgeting not to spend too much on certain areas,
Yeah, and it was, and just one of the things I really liked was getting into the architectural aspects. Even at those times, like I said, we got into at that time, early time in my career, getting into object-oriented programming and looking at, well, what are the concepts? And I think that's one of really the interesting things. What are the concepts for? And one of the the foundations I brought throughout the rest of my career really is always that kind of fundamental principle belief in things, is like, why did object-oriented design philosophies exist? What were they trying to accomplish? What problems were they trying to solve? And so I still remember sort of looking at, taking a few different ways of doing a particular piece of software and looking at encapsulation and understanding, okay, if we did it this way, then it would mean less modifications to this encapsulated area of the code and the inheritance I could have between different objects, and how that might get structured. And I think, again, that's quite in some sense, a rare treat to be able to get to that level of looking at a higher level architecture with that much openness. Nowadays, you often end up, like I said, you're interacting with something maybe that already exists, or even some design patterns that already exist. But at the time, too, like those design patterns were still evolving. There's a famous book in design patterns by the group of four, and that was only had just come out around those times. So it was still, those kind of thoughts were still in development then.
Oh, completely. I mean, it was the people working at Nortel Networks at the time that were kind of help guide you and coach you and kind of help you through that kind of first start of your career.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely had some mentors along the way, and even fundamentals that I've seen people, or I've heard people replicate, later on in my career. But one of the gentlemen I worked with, Scott, was quite influential early on, and I remember him. We were looking at sort of smaller screens then, but his just a general rule of thumb with when you were kind of writing methods or functions, he would say like, okay, you should try to keep them within a visible screen size, and his thing was you could break it down into smaller chunks that make it readable within a screen size that makes it easier for the look consume, right? And it's something that I always thought that aesthetic value that probably you don't think about that often, which is somebody else needs to look at it. What are they looking at it on? How are they viewing your code? And what might make it easier for them, And I remember even at the time I was it had me do things like put in like comments that had just kind of not even words, and just like lines to make it easier if you're scrolling through code to be able to see a separation of things. I just say put a comment with a line on it to sort of make it easier to visually separate what was happening kind of at different points of the code. And those are the kind of things that I thought, like, even I used to do crazy things too, like not crazy things that I thought were more efficient. Like I would line up all my if I had a number of things that I was kind of, assigning variables, I'd line them up so all the equal signs were in a row, and you made it a little bit visually more, easier to digest and a little bit easier to parse. And I always think those things made a difference. I'm a big believer in, I would write out full variable names and constructs that made it quite easy, I think, to read along the code. And so those kind of philosophies that came out about, your code should be very readable in that sense. I always aligned to very early on in my career.
So Nortel as well, networks. You then, was it during Nortel Networks that you came over to the UK, or was it after then when you joined Vodafone?
Yeah, so I came over to the UK in 97. I was still part of Nortel at the time, and that was prior to the whole .com boom bust kind of cycle there. And that's when, shortly after the millennium, that's when Nortel started to basically retract a lot of their spending, and things didn't go quite as accelerated as everybody thought they were going to those times. And so I was very fortunate because as much as the company was heading in a different direction and downsizing, I took the opportunity to head into mobile, which was really still growing at that phase. That was the time of the 3G licenses that, if in the UK, if you remember those kind of being really prominent bidding wars for those kind of things.
It's for the Spectrum, wasn't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And it was Vodafone, I went on to Vodafone, which was down in Newbury headquarters at the time. And I was very lucky, got involved in some of the, mobile payment aspects initially. And that's what sort of my mainstay at Vodafone was doing. And at the time, I was, I remember we were looking at things like, billing onto you're downloading ringtones and logos, and you could add them onto your bill, and you could add, you could do other things too, like have little games inside these tiny little screens and stuff. But it did make me think about even prior to that. You mentioned the early onsets of the internet. I always remembered thinking, because I was working in telecoms, I kept thinking, telecoms companies should get involved with billing people on the internet. They already had a billing association with customers. I was going, they should really become like a payment platform for billing things on the internet. And I was like, but it was never something that, that I should have started up a company at that point doing something like that. But
that's a hindsight thing. Total hindsight thing, isn't it?
I always thought that the telecom companies would just fall into that, adopt that process. So it's kind of funny when I ended up at Vodafone in that kind of world where, we were just billing things onto the internet. And it was funny because the team I was responsible for, what we did is we just basically took requests in for a certain amount of money, let's say it's £2 for a ringtone or whatever, and we would just add it onto the bill. But because we were kind of an interface into the billing system, a lot of projects in Vodafone started to use us as kind of a way for billing for services and for new ideas. Instead of kind of just going to the billing team, they just said, well, we can just use this mobile payment interface to basically do this. We don't have to basically go through the billing, because billing systems were notoriously difficult to change and took long times to sort of modify. So it was interesting. And I remember one of the services they had then, which is one I still think would has some legs in it, but it was a service where you could take a photo and then you could send it to someone in Vodafone with an address, and they would print out a postcard, and they would send it to that person with the photo on it and the address on it and your message, and they would just send the postcard through the mail, and you just paid for it through your bill. And it was I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. I did a few of those, and then at the time, and I was thinking every now and then I think I'd still like to do that now. We still find postcards I'd like to send. So
that's a great idea. I think you can there's one that you can just take a picture and then go to a website, and I think then send the postcard out from there, can't you?
See, probably. I was going to say the service probably exists there somewhere already.
Yeah, I think there may be something there, but not the one directly from it like you're saying. But yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, and talking about the kind of the idea you had about then becoming the kind of or the payment platform and actually open up different avenues. So many companies now actually want to reduce, not use the suppliers, but they own every aspect of the supply chain. And I suppose then it was kind of like, no, that's not what we do. We do this, and kind of staying in their lane.
Yeah. And I don't think anybody really. I mean, I was going to say I was probably in the area where they were looking at most at mobile payments, right? And and I remember even at the time there was two other initiatives we were involved with. One was like just mobile payment for cards kind of thing, sort of like a PayPal kind of idea where you could load your cards into this kind of, into the system inside the mobile network. And then you'd be able to pay for things on your card, but using kind of an interface that, Vodafone had obviously had. But it was kind of early for that, I think. In that time, so, the payment methods weren't quite as set up. So it was a bit clunky, and so at that point, and it was a little bit difficult to do. So they kind of dropped that over a period of time. They just kind of dropped that whole initiative and that project. And the other one that we were involved with was a company called SimPay, and they were looking at trying to bring payment providers from all over the different telecoms, all the different providers together to have a combined payment plan process, right? So therefore, it didn't matter if you want like Orange or T-Mobile or anybody else. You could just have it would all work together depending on what it was. But I think that one I know after a while had fallen through as well too, just because they had trouble getting agreement between everybody at the time. So it just kind of fell apart. But it was, and I think without sort of everybody playing a part, they realized that it wasn't going to be tenable on its own. So, but those are kind of almost precursors to things that, again, if you look back on it now, you'd be like, oh, okay, there should have been maybe why did this not occur? Why did this not happen? Right. So, but it was a really interesting time though. Nobody at the time could predict where things were going. So I think these things were always, the decisions were always taken with kind of, without that kind of hindsight we have now about where things were going. So.
Yeah, no, it's so easy looking back on hindsight, isn't it? So you kind of moved into a kind of technical lead role with Vodafone. Was that the kind of first time that you'd stepped into a more kind of senior tech position, or?
Yeah, I mean, I was responsible initially for the mobile payment stuff, as I mentioned, and I was still, my focus, I felt at the time was really on getting the operations to work well. I mean, there was a fair amount of trying to get obviously new initiatives and features, but I was looking at some of the operational issues that we're handling. And I remember I was still at the time writing a Perl script to basically parse the logs to sort of help us give us, better access to information as we were kind of looking at what was going on with the different, requests that we were getting. But when I wanted to sort of more the project management side of things, and within Vodafone, that was a standard kind of PMO, traditional project office, the budget assigned per project, these kind of things. That was my first real, I think, exposure to that level of project management, enterprise level project management, really. And so it was interesting. I mean, it was good. You'd sit down at the table with like people from all across the company, and it did make you realize the impact of the work that was going on. Somebody would have an idea or an initiative, and you'd be like, okay, great. Here's what we're doing. Here's what the development team is doing on this part of things. Like I said, there might be billing doing something else. There might be customer success team who was there representing sort of what was changes they were going to need to support the customers. You'd have representatives from, like I said, different parts of the business right around the table trying to figure out commercial marketing, whoever it is, how are we going to get this out the door? And it's where you start to really realize, the breadth of, the technology changes you're going to make and what can actually be impacted and where the threads can go. And I still to this day bring those kind of thoughts in as I think about the things that I'm developing and who across the organization needs to be involved in those discussions.
It's such a good way to look at it as well in terms of that project management. I'm sure the triple constraints of, was it cost, time,
and quality?
Quality, thank you. Yes, you saved me. Yeah, kind of pull all the different levers and things together. If you want kind of, things you want it quicker, then it's going to maybe cost more because more people, etc. So all these different kind of areas of pushing projects forward.
Yeah, I'm just thinking. I don't know if it was time. It was certainly time, cost, and I wonder if it was scope to the scope also that I hear of.
Scope, yeah. Sorry, I think you're right. Yeah. Of what you want, yeah. Because then it's thinking about the client budget. They expect it's the budget than actually what they want to pay.
Exactly.
I mean, from Vodafone, we then went on to work with, I think, the biggest e-commerce company now in the world, Amazon.
Yeah, that was quite an interesting transition as well, too, as I just, having just spoken of like sort of the kind of change management process that you would have expected maybe inside of something like Vodafone. It was sort of, release was definitely kind of the big bang. We've got a release ready. We hand it over to the test team who would test things. And even then, you sort of you realize where, all of the processes around things like, agile development sort of come into play, right? Why things are trying to move away from sort of those kind of, walled interfaces where you're just doing waterfall kind of transition. And, you do realize the implications of sort of just handing over something. We'd hand over our development to the test team. The test team would then hand it over to the operations team for deployment and running. And with no continuity between sort of those teams that much, you would have very little, even in terms of like, one of the things I used to challenge the test team on would be like, well, let's prioritize. Like they would highlight testing faults that weren't even something that we had thought were going to be an issue, or weren't something that we assessed would even be an issue in production, because we didn't, like, nobody was using those. They were particularly edge cases, right? But yet the test team would approach things more with that normal, well, everything is more or less equivalent, right? And so it was trying to work within the test team to understand that. And then we did work very closely with the operations team. And that was more, I think, from my perspective, I really liked to get close to the understanding of how the software was being used by people and what was happening. And so trying to build that through the process, I think, was something that I always wanted. And anyway, so that goes on to when we first go to Amazon. I always remember change management process at Vodafone was spend 2 weeks reviewing a code change that is ready to go, send it around to various people who can comment on it, ask questions, et cetera, before it even gets to touch an operations team who are then going to manage the deployment. And my first day at Amazon, I'm, sitting down, or start off first of all with our daily stand up, as you would. And, people go around talking about the things they're working on. And about 4:00 in the afternoon, gentleman sitting across from me stands up, Dave, and he goes, all right, I'm done. And I said, oh, okay, so that was that thing you were working on this morning. What's the release process now? How do we go about getting this out? What's the deployment process? And he looks at me and he goes like, I've already deployed it. And I'm like, what do you mean you've already deployed that? I thought you just did it. Like, you were just working on it this morning. And he said, yeah, but I did it. I tested it this afternoon. Now I've deployed it. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to be fired on my first day. I've not managed this change correctly. I don't know how we manage this now. All I'm thinking of is kind of like, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? And so he says, well, Colt, come here, let me show you something. And I said, okay. So I sit down beside him, and, he walks me through on the screen, and he's showing me basically what is, like, he said, look, here's our entire sort of, fleet of servers. I've deployed an extra one that has our change here. It's running a very, very small amount of traffic, and I'm just looking at and I'm monitoring what's happening there. And he said, first of all, it was a small change. I'm pretty confident of what's happening there. And also he said, and look at here's all these graphs. And he shows me this series of graphs. He's monitoring everything from like latency to like, how garbage collection, everything else, like what's happening on the actual server. And he's basically saying, look, I'm comparing this to every other server that we've got. You can see it's all in line. Everything is going okay. I'm not seeing anything. He said, I'll let that run for a while. And he said, as long as I don't see anything, abnormal in that, I'm not going to just going to let that run and keep an eye on things. And, I'll only pull it back. And if anything happens, I can just quickly take that out. No problem. No issue caused. I can go and look at it, see what the issue was. And I know it's isolated to that particular change, because that's the only change I've made. But if it looks good, then basically after a while, I'll just roll it out across the other servers, And it was this real sort of light bulb moment of, wow, that, like, they've really managed change differently here, And that was really one of the kind of things that, again, you sort of go, and you either lean into these things, or maybe you fear them a little bit. And that is certainly one of the areas that I you kind of lean into, and you sort of, they've embraced change, and what a great way to think about it, right? This is like, change is not something that you fear, and therefore you try to put belts and braces around it. They said change is something we need to do on an ongoing basis to learn and adapt and deliver for our customers. Therefore, we need to make it kind of seamless. We need to make it quick. We need to basically do it in as much of a kind of risk-reduced way as possible. And so they've got all the tooling and all they approach it, and their whole process and all the design principles they use allows for that to happen and encourages that to happen, right? So that's what I thought at the end of the day. I was going, okay, there's a different way of thinking about this here, And, and since then, that was like in 2007. I joined Amazon, and since then, you've seen those practices get adopted across the board, and it wasn't just Amazon doing those at the time. Of course, some of the other leading tech companies were doing that, but this was certainly one of the first places I knew of where they were quite adopting it to that kind of aggressive level. Things like, you hear about continuous integration, continuous deployment, these kind of processes.
And there was an FS company I spoke to, I think it was like maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Someone senior, and we want to bring in some agile coaches, really want to implement agile into the company and stuff like that. And I'm thinking, like, Amazon as an organization, I think they've got their pillars that everyone kind of abides by and they kind of push out into the company. And the values, sorry?
Yeah, the leadership principles, yeah.
Leadership principles, yeah. I mean, and it seems to instill behaviours across the organisation and even giving people the ability to deploy code, that kind of trust or authentic trust that actually given to people to kind of go and make decisions. I suppose that just kind of changes the culture. Like all these things that they just do it so well, even being customer centric, that it just instills into the company.
Yeah, and was that trust and responsibility too? The other thing that went along with that too is like you hear terms like you run it, you own it kind of things. There's kind of go through engineering principles, and Amazon was certainly like that. We had a certain set of servers that we maintained and operated. We also understood exactly what those servers were doing in terms of infrastructure. In terms of like how high their CPU performance would get, what kind of issues were happening with memory collection. I mean, it wasn't just about, oh yeah, we've got written a bit of the software and we hand it off to somebody else to basically figure out what to do with that, right? So when you start to look at that operational nature too, we also had people that were on call and on support, like, for those services. So if you basically did something wrong and you're going to get called at 2:00 in the morning, there's kind of a different level of accountability too, right? It's not so bad if you're going to get called at 2:00 in the morning. It's if your teammate gets called at 2:00 in the morning for something you've done.
Yeah. Really.
So you want to try to avoid that, but that level of ownership and responsibility, again, links me back to, like I said, things that I was doing even at Vodafone, where I was interested in kind of the operational performance of how things are running. And I still maintain to this day it's an element that I think that it's one of the harder aspects, I think, for new developers to come in and understand is the true life cycle of your software, right? So one of the things that I always thought was interesting was asking the question, for instance, how is your feature operating? Not like once you've deployed it, but let's say 3 months down the line, 6 months down the line. For instance, if you're developing, let's say, some improvement to search or some search capability in a website, and you wanted to know, well, is it operating well? Well, when you deploy it, you probably want to look at some things like, well, how many search results am I getting back? What's the latency for those search results? Are people finding things within a certain time period? Simple metrics like that, right? What are they clicking on? But then you might, 6 months from now, it's ideal if you can go back and go, hey, are those still operating within the same sort of boundaries or expectations that I would expect, right? Are they still achieving what I thought they would achieve? Partly both for the board understanding, like, is it working? So if somebody comes up and goes, hey, search is broken, if you can go into a dashboard of metrics and go, well, I can see that my latency for my search results is the same as it's always been, or we're certainly within a boundary of some sort. I can see that I'm getting sort of the quality types of results and people are clicking on things, the kind of things you might look for in that domain. Then you sort of go, okay, I think everything's working fine in here. That allows you to sort of quickly move on maybe to another problem, right? And if there's anything outside of those boundaries too, you can alarm on those things. You can say like, hey, wait a minute, my latency has dropped for my search results. Something's gone wrong here. It might not be because I've changed something in the search code. It might be because basically I've gone into somebody else has had a side effect on what they've done, right? So, but that level of understanding in performance wise, both from a business perspective, but also from an operational perspective, how is your feature working once you've deployed it into production, I think goes part and parcel with the actual development phase. You need to be thinking about that at the development phase, answering those type of questions, because that'll lead you to put in that instrumentation, it'll lead you to put in the things and the signals that are necessary to understand that when it goes live.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting, the impact that these things can have across an organisation. And I suppose you've worked in a lot of different kinds of companies where there's been more legacy, or maybe something's been built on a foundation and there's apps built on top of that, or companies that are more modular, so it's all kind of more separate. Obviously, I don't know what one you prefer, but it's a lot easier if a company is more modular, I assume, than a company where there's a big legacy platform there and things have been laid on over 10, 15 years. Or
that kind of leads on to where I went on to after Amazon, because I went into, after being at Amazon for 8 years, I wanted to go into more different kind of leadership roles. I wanted to basically challenge myself into a different context. And so I went to a student loans company, much more kind of public sector facing kind of organization with different controls, both around sort of the software, how they manage their software process, but also, in terms of, as you mentioned, like what was the tech stack even like? And in those organizations, certainly you had there was a precursor of a legacy system, which was all built on sort of the old Oracle stacks. And the reason I was coming I was being, went in is because I was going to get to stand up the digital organization, was going to lead the new kind of agile methodologies on top of kind of a more of an open source tech stack that was based on some of the things that, like a lot of tech companies were trying to evolve to, right? Mm-hmm. And that was a fascinating time to get involved. But I mean, I think that I think if you're asking me if I have a preference as a technology leader, it's not so much, I think, the architecture as much as what does the architecture achieve? And so modularity tends to allow you to have less dependence between items in your code and be able to therefore deploy things in smaller chunks with less, artifacts, less impacts on other things. And you can do it maybe in a more regular basis, more frequent basis, because also your risk is diminished, right? You're touching a smaller footprint. But to do that well, you need to really understand sort of like, I've seen people develop, things like and people might have seen this in the last couple of years or so. There's been lots of talk about things like microservices or even things like serverless functions and how many people maybe modified their architecture in different ways because of pros and cons and people tend to sort of, maybe because of the nature of the internet, people tend to sort of jump immediately to one end of the spectrum and say it's all good or it's all bad, right? And the reality is probably more somewhere in the middle, which is, if you take some of those paradigms and you implement them poorly, of course, you're not going to get the benefits of what those paradigms were trying to accomplish. Microservices is one where, people often will just sort of go, it's like, oh, okay, I've got to deconstruct my code into the smallest possible, point of granularity. And that's kind of not necessarily to me what it's about. It's about trying to look at, your frequency of change, your, systems that are kind of encapsulated inside of a different need for a different purpose. You might have, when I was at Amazon, we had something like 50 services, that we would be operating. Each had their own kind of little area independence, but some of them would be, for instance, some that were backed by a database, some that were backed by a text file, some were backed by, an in-memory kind of update. And so and that allowed them to scale kind of independently because they were an individual purpose. And so that kind of works well. But I think if you're just, deconstructing things for the sake of going, I want to create a microservice, but you're not understanding what are the benefits you're trying to drive from it, then I think that could certainly lead you down some problematic paths and you end up with sort of some issues there.
Mm-hmm. That's really, again, really, really interesting. I think it's so complicated to think about an organization, think about all the different departments, all the different applications that run different services, different code, and then things being, intertwined together and over many, many years. I think you've got a very hard job.
Well, but I think that's one of the things that people try to think about in leadership is how do you make those jobs? How do you reduce the complexity around those? Right? You're right. If you end up thinking about them in terms of, if you try to think about them as a holistic interaction between 25 components and try to go, how do I get all of these things component wise to work together? Mm-hmm. Then I think you can be quite complex and can be quite, lead you to different problems, right? And I think when I went to student loans, for instance, I had been in Amazon where, of course, like I said, we were responsible for a certain area of our services and the products that we had and the services that we've performed. But we didn't know what was going on in the other parts of the organization. They were running their own development schedules and they might have been up to version 18 on their particular service, and we were up to version 2.8 on ours and one service and version 6.3 on another service, right? I mean, they weren't all tied together, and we were never really worried about whether our version 2.8 worked together with their version 18.3, for instance. Mm-hmm. We just managed ours, but what you have to do then is you have to make sure that your interface basically responds to a certain code of conduct, right? Which is to basically make sure that it performs as its expectation, so that if you're updating things, as long as people that are using your service don't see a difference in or change in behavior, then basically, and that's what you need to control as the owner of that service, then you can maintain that. And so that's really where it goes back to your point about modular kind of, aspects is what you need to do is almost flip it around and go, well, not how do I make sure that all these things work together, but saying if I don't need to worry or I don't want to worry about how all these things are going to work together because I find that is going to be an impractical way to run the business. What do I need to do to basically give these teams the autonomy to develop in their own space and independently?
I mean, you've come from Amazon, which is very forward thinking. They're using all the new agile methodology, CI, CD, like you mentioned. You've stepped into SLC for this kind of, new digital delivery for their bank application banking system as head of digital delivery.
Correct.
There's 200 tech people reporting through you in some way. For those that don't know, that Liston Student Loans Company, I think, is would be one of the UK's largest banks in terms of its loan book. Yeah, it's a lot of money it puts out to students across the UK. How did you first, I suppose, think about that challenge? Was it discovery and then kind of breaking it all down into different parts, or?
I think I've always considered myself a very pragmatic person, right? And I think one of the things you have to be able to do in kind of leadership is maybe have a level of empathy for how other people perceive things. That could be people in your team and other people maybe coming up through the organization, but also other parts of the organization. And I've never gotten, tied into, the specifics of language or dogma. And so I again, it goes back to even, you will have heard me talk about the fundamentals of like object oriented or these kind of things and understanding that. And I think I bring that kind of level of thinking when it comes to agile practices and adopting them, right? And understanding that again, like why are people doing what they're doing in a certain part of the process? Why might they be motivated to change? And how do you encourage them perhaps to try things that are differently, and being even open-minded to basically going, maybe this isn't the right change for this particular context. Every context is different. But one of the ones specifically I know that we worked on, for instance, student loans, and because when I came in, it was also a bit of a growing. But when I came in, there was no team really to start off with. I was kind of the sole person in the team, and I'd brought in what were transformation projects at the time, small sort of independent pieces of code that were being developed in small teams. And so I came in and gave them ownership as kind of an organization structure. But over the course of, after 6 months, we brought in more and more people into the team. We grew the team, took in some of the legacy products in there, tried to bring that up as well, too, into the digital kind of frame of mind. So, you're right. Over a couple of years, I ended up with 200 people on the team. Mm-hmm. And that's quite a different leadership challenge, different aspects to talk about with that. But in terms of the agile principles and then the change, some of it is going like just understanding, again, what is the fundamental benefit you're trying to drive. And I remember having some conversations, first of all, where, people would say things like, the leadership don't want to adopt agile or something along those lines. And I said, okay, well, I don't know, I'll go and ask them what their concerns are. And so I would go up to the people in the executive and I'd say, look, we're adopting these processes where we're going to reduce the risk of delivery by, having shorter timeframes. And what we're going to do is we're going to report back on a regular basis and check with both, yourself, give you updates on the delivery and check with the actual expectations in terms of the customer, that they're getting what they want. And we're going to set these up so that, we more likely get the outcome we want in a shorter period of time within budget. Is that okay with you? And they said, yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, I'd love to see that. And we were like, I've walked out and I went back to my people and I said like, yeah, I think they're all over. That's exactly what they want. And so again, it depends on how you frame it. But, if you just walked in there saying, we're going to set up all these agile practices, and again, trying to understand what they're hearing is maybe going to be like, okay, but like I'm thinking of the benefits. When am I going to see the customer output? Am I going to get the right results, commercially? Mm-hmm. I think you've got to tie those two things together, right? And it's not. I think again, it goes back to understanding what their concerns might be. There was, even in terms of change management, they were very much in the process of they would have a change release. Managers responsible for changes going out the door and deployments going out the door. And so when we would deploy software in the teams, we would be required to basically submit things to them, who then they would then go, okay, we will review the deployment and let you know if that, we can do that in the right time frame. We wanted to basically have one of our teams that would be responsible for their own deployments and just deploy more, not necessarily, and trying to find the compromise, right? Not just deploying ad hoc whenever they wanted. We realized that was probably a step too far. But we said, look, can we have more control in the development team for deployments? And they said, well, we're here to make sure that change, is deployed, safely and, and without issues. And I was like, okay, so how is that going for you? What do your measurements show you? And it was funny because then they paused. They went like, sorry. And I was like, well, what do you are you stopping? Is there no further changes? Are there no further issues in production? And they were like, well, no, we still get issues in production every now and then. We're trying to minimize those as much as possible. And I said, okay, well, look, could we actually just try this for a bit? What we can do is maybe say, look, if we want to deploy something, we'll give you up to 8 hours, 4 hours to 8 hours notice. And then as long as you say okay, we'll give you guys get a notification ahead of time. So you can at least then say, well, wait a minute, we have some other concern that's not related to your deployment, but we have some other concern that we can hold it up for. We'll give you the chance to sort of say that. But if not, then we'll basically just deploy it and we'll see how it goes over a course of 3 months and see what happens. And we went over the course of 3 months and there was no issues with our deployments at all. And so then they were much more happier to sort of go, okay, well, we can actually work with you to deploy these things on a more frequent, more regular basis. And so to me, it's kind of like working hand in hand and trying to understand it's not about, even in government, it was about understanding the regulatory and audit requirements around those kind of areas and trying to, get down to the base requirement of why are those things there and how to basically do we work within those constraints that respect those constraints, but still actually deliver as much as we can towards a better value for the customer, for the taxpayer, and for the business.
Oh, amazing. I mean, it's a big change I can imagine for the organization to go through. But as you say, you just broke it down, explained the benefits rather than just going to say, we're going to go agile. And then that change, fear response, sort of knee-jerk kind of response sometimes comes in. They're like, no, we're not doing that. But when you actually kind of put through the pros and cons,
Yeah, and one of the things I had heard earlier on too was that ability to sort of say, well, try it, because almost if you approach somebody and say, are you willing to try this? Then it's really hard for somebody to say, well, I'm not even willing to try, right?
Yeah.
But if you can scope that trial to be something, like you said, that is not kind of it's not kind of a this is a turning point, but is a true kind of, we think we're going to be able to achieve certain benefits. Here's what we think we can achieve. Here's what we want to try for what duration. And then at that point, we'll give an assessment for everybody to kind of, reassess. Because oftentimes, like you said, their concerns are mainly fear-based, right? Okay, well, if this goes wrong in a certain way, maybe the people you're dealing with are still kind of accountable in many ways to those kind of things, right? And so if you can mitigate it to a known context where they can go, okay, worst case scenario, if that goes wrong, is pretty manageable, then it becomes very hard for them to sort of go, well, I'm going to resist that by any way, because they want to, genuinely, they want to see their areas improve most of the time as well, too. Mm-hmm. So, and they're willing to try things and learn in many cases as well, too. I think I used to get people that would say things like, those people are just unwilling to change. Those people just don't want to change. And I remember at one point sitting down and go, that seems like a very broad statement. I mean, like, they're just unwilling to change at all about anything. It's kind of what the statement came across as. And I was like, if I went over and I offered them, said, we're going to give you £5 million, would they be like, whoa, no, that's a big change in my life. I don't think I'd like that, because most of the time I think we get a pretty positive response. But I think that, so what it then makes you kind of reassess is, well, what's the type of change that I'm bringing forward that maybe gives them more of a hesitation or fear, right? And some of that is really just looking at it and going, well, I think people, retain or, appreciate the value in their contributions to an organization. And if you can actually think about what is the value they contribute and how do you retain that sense of value and throughout maybe a transitionary period or a change. Mm-hmm. And that could be basically offering them some way of sort of like training or leadership or other kind of aspects to grow with the change, or even be benefited from the change itself. Like if you're introducing a change, you're saying, hey, look at your metrics are for the reduction of bugs in production, and we think we can help you achieve a better reduction, a better metric outcome, then oftentimes you're going to get like a much more positive response.
So obviously from Student Loans Company, there are a number of other organisations that you've worked with until present in a kind of CTO capacity. Do you want to kind of touch on some of them, Dwayne, and give us an overview of what kind of organisations they were? Yeah,
it was funny because I think that the transition, of course, I really enjoyed the transition to student loans. It helped me grow as a leader. Like I said, just challenges of running a team of 200 is completely different, and a completely your levels of expectation, communication, et cetera, and how you structure that, what you do on a day-by-day basis is very different. And oddly enough, the thing I really missed was, I think from the Amazon days, is really getting a real product focus. So in Amazon, I really gravitated to understanding how we're going to deliver for customers, what we were going to do, and also innovating new ideas, right? And coming up with new ideas on that aspect. But anyways, so I started to really gravitate towards more CTO roles where I felt that was my next step career-wise, so I could get involved with both the strategic direction of the company. I had some thoughts that I had been developing around that. And really into kind of the product management aspects too. I've been doing reading on agile and development. I really wanted to be involved both in not only setting up the technology, but also the culture as well too. I did some element of that in terms of what would I define as the culture within student loans, and how did I think I helped perhaps contribute to that. Also, and everybody in the organization at the end of the day contributes to the culture too. I think that that's really a fundamental aspect you have to understand as a leader. Is you can do a lot. I think certainly by your behaviors and what you're trying to adopt and how you structure things. But I think the people inside the organization as well, too, are really important to what kind of culture you're going to develop. That was more so in a smaller organization. So I went through Zito, working with some places where we're looking at delivering tuxedos, online. And then, went to Skyscanner for a short period and then pulled back into a CTO role for an ed tech company. Loved sort of doing that. But that was only a short period for some dog. But in those kind of spaces, what I was really trying to look for was that growth in terms of product management as well. And that's when I started to work with Crichton as CTO and really CPTO in that role, where both the product and the technology team were within my remit. And I really enjoyed that aspect of thinking of product road mapping. How do we start to prioritize as an organization? And even from the completely strategic level, what are we doing strategically to help move the company forward? And looking at, I think underneath that, maybe I was also trying to think about, would I ever like to sort of be a founder, start my own company? After Crichton, I got the opportunity to do that with a startup called Reveal, where I was co-founder with two other gentlemen, and did that for a couple of years as well too. So there's some experiences in there I can certainly talk about, and that's led to where I am now at head of product engineering as Flatfair. But certainly over the last, I'd say 5 years, especially, really digging into sort of the product management aspects and trying to really understand how to blend, product development, product management, and technical development.
I suppose that kind of leads us very nicely into kind of part two in that intersection of product and engineering. But this might be a silly question. Hopefully there's no silly questions on this podcast. But you think that would be something that would always happen on both areas? But I take it that's not been the case through many organisations through the years, that they've always been separate.
Sorry, is your question that it's most often separate, or that it's most often together? Or
it's I suppose it's most often separate, and this is something more new that kind of someone would oversee both areas, or is that always the case?
I think it depends on the organization, actually. I think and I don't even know if it's quite as distinct as that. When I was at Amazon, we were responsible for an area of the business. We had a specific business metric that we were trying to improve that was, based on eventually revenue into the company, but it was basically a leading indicator into that. So it was a smaller metric that we could control. And I think that we had a lot of, ability to influence that and decide what kind of things we would propose, our roadmap for the year through a process that we would then surface to senior management. And I always liked that process. I always thought that was good because it wasn't a purely bottom up. We have full autonomy to basically do whatever we want. You would definitely propose things. And the reason you propose things was to get instructed guidance and information based on people who had probably a different visibility of the organization than you did, right? It wasn't because they wanted some control and autonomy. It was basically to help you understand, well, you're doing something over here. I like that aspect of this proposal. And, that seems really good. However, I'd like to see you maybe expand more on, X or Y. This other idea over there, I'm really not sure about. Here's why I don't know if that would really be a good place to invest because of X. And you take that feedback on board. And they might even tell you things like, and then one of the things maybe you're not aware of is, strategically we're heading in this direction. Can you think about how you might influence that kind of area? So there's good benefits to doing that. And I think that level, that's one of the things around leadership and autonomy. I think that is difficult for people to work with. Is autonomy is not isolated decision making. Autonomy is about making good decisions in line with the people and your stakeholders you're working with. So, and I remember when I started dealing with product, even as early as, in one of the companies in Zito, I was dealing with product owners at the time who were making decisions, and I was trying to guide them a little bit and saying, I think they felt if they were challenged on a decision, I think they felt that challenged their autonomy. And my response was, you should be prepared to be challenged on things. You should have a rational reason for why you're making these kind of decisions. Now, and be prepared to take on board new information, debate that. Now, not indefinitely, but obviously you should be. And in fact, when you think about it in that dimension, what you should be doing is almost going out and soliciting some of that information ahead of time as you're making that decision. Mm-hmm. So when you are kind of in a sense of autonomy, you're making decisions. Ideally, you want to be involved with the stakeholders so that you're making the best decision possible, right? It's not about going off into a room and just going, I've got autonomy, I'm going to make this decision on my own. Mm-hmm. It's about understanding what the stakeholders might have that can influence you and help you make a good decision so that when you come out and say, here's why we've made decision X, that you have a solid foundation upon which to make that kind of discussion and that kind of argument. And so that's going back to the product aspects. To me, as I started getting into things, people would ask me throughout all my entire career, can we have a technical change for X or Y? And my automatic reaction to all of that was always like, well, why? What are you trying to accomplish, right? And that naturally falls into the product leaning aspects, which is, well, if I'm trying to get this problem solved or that thing done, then actually we want to be involved in that kind of what is the solution that's going to help you accomplish that, rather than just hitting a technical change. And I've had many times throughout my career where somebody has said, we're looking for this technical change, and for various reasons we would have said, okay, we adopt that technical change, and and then they've come back to us and gone, that doesn't help me because I thought this was going to help me do X and Y, which is what I wanted it to do, but this doesn't help me do that. And you end up going, well, no, you're right, it doesn't. We could have told you that at the beginning, but you didn't tell us what the problem was. You told us what you wanted in terms of a technical change. And so therefore you have to start working collaboratively and understanding too, it's not necessarily about telling people that, hey, don't ask me that, don't ask for that requirement, because people will try to drop into that solution mode they're trying to be helpful, right? They're thinking, I think I've understand what I want, and here's what I think I need. And they want to make it as simple as possible for you. But I think it's the onus is then on you as a development team to go, okay, well, let's just verify that. So what problem you're trying to solve? And then maybe maybe exactly what they've asked for is exactly what they need, but maybe it's not, right? Maybe you can actually help them and say, well, if we did it this way, we could accomplish the same thing, but in half the time. Or, if we did this thing, or maybe this particular thing you're asking for isn't going to deliver that particular solution. Like, Amazon, we might be looking at a particular piece of data that we're trying to deliver for some team, and they're expecting that piece of data to reflect something specific. And we know that it doesn't necessarily reflect that. It has a much different meaning so they're only seeing part of the puzzle there. But yeah, I think overall, you absolutely need to be thinking about what is product and technology kind of hand in hand if you want to be successful.
I mean, completely. And listen to you kind of talk through that. And I always think about, you don't know what you know, and you don't know what other people don't know. And, I suppose within an organization, hopefully I can put this the right way, but communication is so key, So like you're saying with strategy, people down here might not know what the strategy is. Say product owners, they might have an aspect of something they're working on, or engineers might not. And then when a product owner sees a problem that they want to solve, they're then using the solutions or the tools that they know about to apply to that problem. Whereas an engineer that's 20 years experience has all these other kind of tools that they could be using. And if you just show them that problem, it's kind of like, oh, wait, now we've actually got this. Yeah.
100%. Yeah. And, I always there's certainly been a movement towards when you start to look into the product space, and where people are going with agile teams, right? There's certainly a movement towards giving people more goal-oriented kind of, and outcome-oriented kind of roadmaps, outcome-oriented kind of pursuits, right? And the reason for that, though, is twofold. One, because yes, you want them to be buying into that too, but you also want them to really understand, like, what is the value they're trying to deliver, and how might that work for the customers? What's important to the customers in those aspects, right? And I always say that if you're successful doing this later, two things can happen. One is that, your team can somebody in your team can go, I know you've said that we want to, deliver X, but I think that if we do it, this methodology B versus methodology A, we can get there in half the time. Or they might find some other going, actually, if you want to deliver that value, if we did what you're asking for, as well as kind of, or what we're talking about, as well as, something else with just a small extra change for 2 days work, we can deliver 50% more benefit, And that's where you start to really get the gains from that, right? They start to get really involved in the problem solving and the aspects of what they're trying to deliver. Take that forward a bit from one of the previous topics we talked about too. Then they also naturally start to gravitate to, well, how am I going to measure that? How am I going to witness that? How am I going to evidence that when it's in production? What kind of metrics and instrumentation do I need to put in to show that it's going to deliver that business value? And I think that's one of the areas that I think even today as an implementation team, it's really hard to get to work fundamentally across the engineering team. When I was at my last company in Reveal, we had, a pretty standard Kanban board in Jira. We had this, start, and then things were in implementation. But I think I probably had the most columns that other developers had ever seen, because I had all these things like, okay, when it was in pull request, but I also had one, it would go into deployment, but then after deployment, it would go into validation. And validation was, okay, after you've deployed it, you put it into validate state. And that's really where you go and look at the metrics that are being impacted, and did the actual business, impact we were looking for get achieved? And so I actually integrated that right into the actual Kanban board in Jira, because I wanted to have a validation step where I wanted engineers to be thinking, this is the next step after I deploy to production, is to then go and see, did the business value get achieved? And I thought it was our responsibility as an engineering team to do that.
That's a great idea, yeah, to kind of validate it, not just say, like, if you put in production, that's kind of me finished, that's over and done with, but actually going and quantifying was it benefits, needs analysis, whatever it is, to kind of see actually was it delivered? So it was in the business case at the start, or in that kind of, spec at the start, was that delivered in the end? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that I continue to say, I think that one of the, the biggest kind of hurdles we have is our own tooling in some sense and doing things. And even, Jira is such a common tool for teams but it's such an implementation, kind of specific tool. It kind of really gets into kind of, you're almost kind of ready to implement something. You develop something and goes through testing and various phases of implementation. And then usually done is like deployment, and done is out in production. And, so, but to me, it's the things that go on before you get to that phase of a ticket appearing in Jira, and the things that go on afterwards that are also equally important for the life cycle of the product. And when you start thinking product and bringing those two things together, when you start thinking of bringing product and engineering together, you really start to glue on other parts of the process that prior to that phase of things, kind of cards appearing in Jira, and like, what is the structure of those cards? How did you get there? Bringing the development team into those discussions, but also at the tail end of that too, like I said, validation phases and getting the delivery team being responsible for, did that business metric, was that business metric achieved? And that folds into things like this. If you're doing OKRs to that level too, you can sort of blend those in as well too. Teams find that's helpful as well too. And that's, another way to sort of help structure that. Again, that's a kind of a product business layer on top of trying to those maybe delivery structures.
And that's kind of trying to bring alignment on that strategy of, engineering and product direction across the company together. Is there any examples you'd like to give? Any big wins you've had where it has been the focus of bringing product engineering together that you've got a win out of it, or a big one?
You know what? Most of them are I think, are areas where I'm going to say even in student loans, I was going to say this goes back to a little bit more of the agile kind of ways of working. I'll touch on some of the smaller company stuff where I've done, but even in student loans, I always remember one of the things that they had done was talking to the business side of things, the development side, and bringing that into the team. They said, here's what we're trying to do. They'd broken it down into sort of smaller kind of releases, and they'd, what we're trying to accomplish, let's do first of all this particular kind of delivery. They did one delivery. I think they did a second iteration on top of that. And they had a number of other sort of product improvements that were originally planned. But I think what they had found is once they sort of achieved the results after the kind of the second implementation, the second iteration, they were like, we've kind of achieved what we wanted to achieve here. Do we need these other, these other pieces of that implementation? And they decided, well, let's pause on that. Actually, they're not, those were intended to deliver some of the value we're already seeing. So therefore they decided, well, we're actually not needing to really do that. And so that meant they focus on other aspects, right? So just that kind of saving of perhaps maybe what would have been either wasted development or saving time in that sense was one space I saw that. But ever since then, I said, like, either in other parts of the organization, looking at where just communicating the product, the product goals, right? When I was at Crichton, we were trying to deliver, well, it's a bit of a content management system. We were developing mobile apps. We wanted to develop a better interface for people in the hotels and administrators there to maybe update the content inside of their app. And we developed pretty much a content management system, very light touch kind of thing, just to modify certain aspects of our app. Well, when we were developing that, we were very clear on, well, what is it that the customers really want to do? It wasn't about just like, here's a wish list of requirements and here's the things that we want to put in it. It was like, well, the main things they're trying to do is, maybe make text updates, image updates, these kind of things. And so there was other aspects that we could have included initially, but because we sort of really focused on what is it initially we wanted to get out, we pared it down to, what a lot of people would just say was an MVP. It really just looked at what are the basic requirements and then understanding that and delivering that first and foremost. And so that was good because we were able to de-scope the work again down to a smaller piece of functionality and get that out the door first. And that was another example of just kind of getting things done that you needed to get done. We did the same thing. I thought when we were in Reveal, that was one point where I did work with Marcel, who was our CPO, was really good at the time because he was very, very much in favor of working closely with us. So he was involved in a lot of the discussions with the engineering team as well, too. So we encouraged that. And so oftentimes what he would do is he would say, here's where I want you to start. And then as you develop that, I want to see what you're doing so that way I can help me refine the rest of the deliverables as well, too, because some of the things I won't actually even be able to tell you exactly how I want them to work until I see them in operation and how they're actually functioning. Because we were developing more of a SaaS tool for product teams, but he then was able to sort of really take that kind of startup short iteration mentality and go just like not even like try to deliver this and then let me see it. It was like, I want to see it as you're developing it because that'll help me inform what the rest of your development's going to look like. And so those 10 things worked really well, I think, for getting the right outcomes and shortening the timeframes for deliveries.
I mean, how do you balance then like technical innovation, product strategy, and then market needs when it comes to this?
Well, I think innovation is an interesting one, right? Because I think that innovation, I think, is one that is actually easier to do when you're thinking about the goals rather than starting from where you are. I think you mentioned something earlier about saying, you know, when you're in a certain context and you're not starting, you know, not wanting to go from the context I'm in and just sort of being constrained within that context, but being able to break out of that a little bit. But I think one of the ways to do that is to not say, okay, given where we are now, what's the next thing we want to do? But to rather to say, well, where do we want to be and how do we get there from where we are? You know, and again, there's, you know, throughout my career, there's been different people that have challenged that kind of thinking where I've gone, you know, people have said, okay, well, you know, there's a complete difference between you if you're saying, look, okay, our mobile app is deployed onto, you know, a few handsets, you know, now, and we want to grow that by 10%. And if somebody came in and asked the question and said, well, yeah, but I mean, what would you need to do if you wanted to grow it by 10,000%? You'd be like, 10,000% would mean like 90% of the people in the country have that on their installed on their phone. You'd be like, okay, what would we need to do to do that? Well, I don't know, maybe you can go talk to your mobile operators and see if they can install it from point of sale. Okay, well, can we do that? You know, it just gives you a different level of problems to get through rather than just, well, if I'm going to do this and I want to go from X to Y, how do I do that? And I think sometimes when we're talking innovation, like I really, oh, go ahead.
I love that. That's what I'm in my head there thinking about it. Like you think, you know, the next step, you're looking down the way, it's the next stone on a path, whatever it is, you know, down the journey. But if you actually try and go to 2 3 years, 4 years, what that goal was, and then breaking down those steps, what are the bits? And I love that. It's really good.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned kind of like a journey, right? If you just said, where could I, I'm just thinking, if you said, where can I go on my bike today? You'd be like, okay, well, I can go from where I am now to be, but if you went to go like, okay, if you said, I want to bike, I don't know, across South America, you might be like, what would I need to do that? Well, I'm probably going to need to change my bike, I'm going to need a different sort of nutrition system, or, you know, you'd be doing something completely different, right? And so none of them are incompatible, but it's just a slightly different approach and depends on what you want to achieve. But that's that whole level of also just innovation. I think it's also trying to not cap people's thinking. I mean, I know that there's things like we talk about psychological safety a lot in organizations, but I think that applies equally in terms of innovation. I think it's trying to get people to think a little bit outside their normal kind of way of thinking.
What role would you say then does customer feedback play in kind of shaping?
You know, customer feedback's absolutely critical, obviously. I mean, you know, you really need to be sort of tuned into that. But I would say you also need to be careful of how you interpret that. I think that it's also really useful to get that learning from customers fully circled and adopted across the organization. So there's two things I'll probably say about that. One is, I remember when I was in student loans, I was asked to do a presentation on being a data-centric company. Because I'd come from Amazon, they were like, can you talk to this? And I went down to London and spoke to some people in government on being a data-centric company. And when I was thinking about the presentation, I was thinking, how am I going to structure this? What am I really trying to say here? And what I ended up coming around to was this idea of kind of a flywheel effect, right? Where, I've touched on sort of like putting in the instrumentation in the development cycle to basically give you some sort of metrics and indications of output that you might want to learn from in the product, you know, how people are using your product, how people are interfacing with it. And I think you take that forward, you then go through a process of analysis and understanding of what are you learning about the customer behavior based on that. And to your point, that might be qualitative information, it might be quantitative information, but that's good feedback either way, right? Quantitative is still customer feedback. It's just maybe more objective in terms of what you're actually seeing, but it still requires a level of interpretation on top of that. Qualitative feedback obviously could be just, they're feeding back things in terms of customer feedback forms or other processes. you've got. But then to me, the other thing is the kind of the final leg I'd put in there was what do you do with data? How do you disseminate that learning as much as possible? And how do you make sure that people understand? So if you're learning something about the customer through that process, standing up in front of an organization, which is slightly easier at a smaller company, a startup, where you're going, here's what we tried and here's what we've learned about the customer. We thought we went into this thinking the customer would like X or Y. What we've done now, we've realized that here's the way they behaved and clicked on this button more than that one. That gives an indication that, that maybe they like this better, X better than Y. Here's the qualitative feedback that they're providing. They wanted to go in there. I'm a big supporter of things like false door tests, these kind of things where, if you, especially as a small organization, if you're wondering, hey, you know what, I think customers are going to want to share this particular page when they get onto it, put a share button on it, see what happens, and even if then when they click on it, what they get is, we're implementing the share feature now. Do you want to be part of that process? Give us your email address and let us know what you're thinking about how the share should work, what you should do with it. That's okay. Maybe you don't do that obviously for months and months on end, but if you do it for a couple of weeks and you get a kind of an indication of, 60% of our customers that land on this page press the share button. Well, then now having a good indication of customer feedback on how much people might like that, right? If 2% of your customers come in and click on that share button, you might be like, you know what? Nobody actually really wanted to share it. And so either we've misunderstood something about the customer or the button's button's maybe not obvious enough, or we don't really need to develop that. And that's fine too. That's a great way to sort of not have to build the feature to find out that you don't have to, customers weren't going to use it in the first place. But you have to be careful with that. Obviously, you're not wanting to disappoint customers when you're doing that. And so it requires, but most of the time, I think customers understand as long as you're pretty transparent and open with them about saying, here's what we're doing and here's why. And we want you to be involved in that process. I think customers tend to respond to that favorably.
And not to put any pressure on you, but if I said in 2 years, so 3, 5, 10 years, what do you think of product and engineering and how that'll evolve in the tech industry over that time?
Yeah, certainly it's really interesting at the moment. I think with AI coming up and, where is that leading to in terms of, team structure? Where is that leading to in terms of, don't want this to be a podcast on AI because it'll be just melted into the background of thousands of other podcasts on AI. Yeah, exactly. But you certainly see the role of AI, how it affects maybe coding and how it maybe affects product management, influencing that. So, and the two areas I've seen mostly, like in product management, you're seeing a lot of tools, as you mentioned, where you're just touching on customer feedback, where the qualitative feedback especially is being analyzed and structured using AI tools. And that's really powerful, right? Because prior to, I think, some of the recent advancements in AI, quantitative feedback from customers is incredibly more useful simply because it's really easy to structure it and understand it and assess it and analyze it, right? Qualitative feedback is always much more messy and harder to really get a good, clear signal from. It's all over the place. Whereas if you can use AI to basically go through that qualitative feedback and almost structure it like quantitative data, so you're answering similar questions with messier content coming on the input side, then you can sort of, get pretty interesting results with that and not without a lot of kind of heavy lifting as well, too, with AI, thankfully doing some of that work. I think on the other end of the spectrum, too, you talk about development tasks and how AI is modifying that. Things like copilots certainly helping with some of the heavy lifting there. And, I think over time, you're going to see that kind of like right now, most teams are probably structured like, a product owner and maybe 4 or 5 developers, and the product owner is kind of structuring some of the actual, input of new features and development alongside maybe a graphic designer, trying to figure out what those features are going to look like, handing them over to the product team, to the development team, or working with the development team to really, build those and consider how they're going to work. But the bottleneck there, if you're thinking about that kind of structure, is that the capacity for the product owner and the graphic designer kind of are need to work alongside feeding the work of maybe 4 or 5 developers who are basically working at the coding. The coding would tend to be sort of a bigger bottleneck in that process, right? If you start to get really accelerated in the coding side of things, and those developers can, let's say, maybe you only need 2 or 3 to develop the same amount of code, then if you're kind of in charge of that organization, it's not that the developers maybe disappear, but maybe you change the structure of that around. If you're still investing heavily in learning and growing your business, maybe you end up with 3 product owners and 5 developers, or 3 product owners and 3 developers, who are that the rate of change and the capacity you have for processing through customers' feedback to trial of new idea to getting something out the door that is testing something and getting feedback back into the organization, you end up just widening that capacity, right? It's like going from dial up to broadband, really. If you start thinking through the amount of change maybe you can get through, and then you could spend more in an organization on that product management side, getting more feedback through your now AI assisted kind of qualitative assessments, giving you insights on a quicker basis that you then structure into some sort of new ideas that your developers now have more of an ability to more quickly get out the door through AI copilots that they're helping them develop some of the code and tests and trials to do that. You may even have areas where the product owners can have full control of levers where they can actually make code modifications within some AI structured code developer on their own, right? And they can then pull about 4 or 5 different levers at one time to make changes on their website that is helping them get a better understanding of where things are going. So, and where I see it is, I don't think I think it maybe will tip the balance more towards product management in terms of learning and developing and understanding your customers quicker, better, faster. I think organizations as a whole, I think will continue to thrive the faster they are learning about their customers, the faster they can get quicker iterations and understand what their customers want. And the more, I guess, the more cheaply they can try out ideas and see if they're working or not.
I suppose, it kind of leads into my last question, was advice for tech leaders that were looking to enhance that synergy between product and engineering. Is there more you can give on that?
You know what? So, yeah, the whole, I think I have kind of 3, I think of this like leadership, especially tech leadership and product engineering leadership, especially as kind of 3 overlapping kind of circles in terms of Venn diagram kind of thing, right? I think one is certainly the people aspect. I think the other one second one is like strategy, and that's like your business and development strategy, you're all of that inclined in terms of your delivery strategy. But I think the third one is communication. And I think for every one of those, you kind of have data and processes that underpin each one of those areas. But I think that as you start to look at those, I think leaders in general have focused a lot on this people aspects, this delivery aspect. Sometimes you get engineer and technical leaders who are better at one than the other. I think product certainly fits into both camps, but I think communication is one of the ones that often is, I'm going to say, undervalued. I think that it's really hard to get right in terms of what is the amount of communication you need to deliver to the team. How do you find the time to structure that communication? Like, I don't think structured communication is oftentimes what people think about. When am I going to relay my product strategy? How often am I going to do that? How often am I going to update it? Who am I going to communicate to? Is it just going to be in presentation form? Is it going to be in written form? Also, how do I get feedback on that? How do I feed back into that? You have a whole area now of product operations coming out, which is really looking at, if you're a product management organization and you're going to rely on that kind of, like you said, customer feedback, qualitative feedback, data, coming in, which is maybe analytical data from your features. How do you systematically drive that into your levels of your organization that need that information? That in itself requires tooling, requires ongoing upgrades and improvements, and there's a whole area on product operations now evolving, which is how do you feed that? How do you structure that part of the actual delivery cycle? So I think if you're a technical leader, I think looking at understanding your business goals, what kind of aspects of your business, that you're doing maybe lead into that, or how are you going to deliver that? Helping your teams really understand how they link to that business goal. So when I talk to my teams, even now, one of the things that I ask them is, I start off, like, for instance, quarterly goals by talking to my team members and going, how do you want to contribute to the goals in this quarter? Like, what do you think you will achieve? And, one of the things that I found really enjoyable is kind of, it takes a little bit of an adjustment for people to think about it, but I've asked people to go and say, okay, to do your next year's, kind of your think about your development plan. I want you to move ahead to some point in time. Let's say 6 months in time. Let's say a year in time. But 6 months maybe is a good time period to think about it. And I write down your self-assessment for, like, at that date. So, we're at the 3rd of April. So let's say April, sort of let's say September, right? We're 4th, 10th. Let's say October. So let's say it's like, the 3rd of October, and, put that date on it and write down, say, okay, Michael Fair, okay, what do you want to have achieved? And then and then take that and let's start to talk about that, right? So people write down things like, well, I want to have grown in the last period. I have grown as an engineer. Mm-hmm. Okay. How have you done that? Well, I have grown my technical skills in terms of delivery and, in terms of breaking down problems and, okay, let's make up a project. What project do you think you got to work on in that time period that gave you that? Well, I worked on a project that spanned not only our authentication service, but it also spanned, our content management service. And I got to basically work on some infrastructure parts of the project as well, too. Okay, great. And what feedback would you expect from people? Like, who would you expect to get feedback? How are you going to validate that that's something that, you've improved upon? Well, I'd expect my colleagues to write, okay, let's write down, what would you expect them to write about you? Give me an example of something they would write.
I'm going to work for you, Dwayne. You've got this in the bag.
Yeah. Well, but it's that, like, once you start getting into actual specific stuff, they'd say something like, well, I'd expect them to write something like, Michael's been great to work with because he's really understood all the detail of the project. And he's basically, was able to evidence this in the weekly meetings we had together where, he showed me his updates and he's going, okay, so now you start to get into real tangible kind of, okay, so you're going to have weekly meetings with this person where you're going to show them stuff. You're going to, and it just helps to have that discussion of like, well, but the funny thing is when I discuss it with people, they go, you want me to do what? Like, okay, so I just want to kind of maybe on this or that. But if you can really, it sounds like grandiose, but if you can kind of get them to just really adopt kind of, you're in that moment, let's play with it as much as possible as we need to. But let's really think about, like, if you're in that moment, what does the last 6 months look like for you? And let's try to see how we manifest that. It sort of goes back to like what you're saying about like, the innovation idea in some respect, right? If you can imagine what that, you being in that position, let's not think about where we are now and how do we move to the next step. Let's think about where you are in the next step and what do you need to do between now and then to, as much as possible, get there, right? It's not even about holding them to some sort of artificially high goal, but if they're going to have some fun kind of coming up with those goals and having some fun kind of getting there, then that's really important. And going back to, I guess, your structure of the question, ideally, if they're saying, here's how I've contributed to that. I think at the end of this project, I want to be able to say that, hey, we had this OKR to develop X by 20%. And, I want people to be able to feedback to me that I was instrumental in that and that they feel that probably without me, I would have only achieved 10%. Okay, that's a great thing to talk about. How are we going to get there? How do we get there? What would we have done to do that?
Well, it's great. It's great advice, totally is. And it makes you kind of, I suppose, maybe even reach for more. And, if you ask someone a question a certain way of saying, what is next? I don't know. And then you're saying, when you anchor it in the future or anchor it to something bigger and then break it down, you actually do know because you're just looking at it from a different angle, Well,
and you can have some fun with it too, right? You're not, I think if you start from where you are, you kind of more readily go to, is that next step achievable? You almost like do it more evolutionary. It's almost like, I have kids who are at university kind of age now. They're getting into university stages. And even as they were going through high school, you could see, I like dealing with the psychology of people and how people think of things. And you could see when they were asked for instance, to do, let's say, an essay, and you could see them bring up a document, and go like, okay, introduction, and after a while I went to them, you don't have to start with an introduction. You can just, especially now with, computer, you're not writing on a piece of paper. You can just start anywhere and just start writing down an idea, or writing down some structures, writing down some thoughts, and then you can move things around and structure them in different ways, right? You can actually just change them around. You can just go, I'm going to start writing this because this is the first idea that I've got, and start typing it in. And then you can actually go, okay, now actually, wait a minute, this is making me think that the introduction should be more X rather than Y. And I think it works the same way when people are talking about sort of like their career development path. You could be sitting there thinking about it and going, well, rather than thinking like I'm starting from this point, what's the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and thinking like you'd write an essay or something like that from an introduction on forward. If you can just go, just tell me, just talk to me about anything that you see yourself in the context of where you are in 6 months. It could be anything, right? And then it gives them much more freedom. Then you could start to then pull on some threads and then expand from that. And it all becomes like a mind map a bit more then, right? You start to then go, okay, well, let's take it from there and let's expand on this part. Let's expand on that part. Let's take it from there. And as you start to evolve, then you start to get those kind of interesting questions. And some maybe are more fruitful than others. Others might kind of go off into sort of a bit of a meandering kind of space. You might be like, okay, that's kind of, that's not really leading anywhere. But others you'll find more fruitful in terms of they get really excited about some aspect of it. And they start to, even then, right, you start to go, well, it seems like you're really enjoying this aspect and really excited about this. That seems like an area where maybe they explore more. And it's oftentimes too because they don't know. Maybe they don't know at the time too that, that this is what I'm interested in, what I really want to explore more. And you start to discuss it. And it's about opening those avenues for discussion.
Yeah, get them thinking about it, I suppose. Yeah. Oh, awesome. I mean, that was part 2, Dwayne, of the intersection of product and engineering. Part 3, some quick fire personal questions for you. Do you have any favourite technologies or tools that you're particularly excited about right now?
Well, I'm going to avoid saying AI because, obviously that's what, everybody is kind of focused on at the moment. But one of the things that I think is really interesting, I've been in, it's not new, but like augmented reality and virtual reality, I think is quite interesting at the moment. I think there's lots of things going on in the background there. And I wonder, obviously there are consumer products coming out on a regular basis that are kind of the next level and challenging where we are with things. And I just wonder if it's going to be, a turning point like we saw with ChatGPT, where AI was kind of developing in the background, and there was obviously work going on in AI much more longer before, ChatGPT came around. But when ChatGPT came onto the landscape, it kind of exploded. And I think that's the way things are going to happen almost with kind of AR. I think augmented reality may be a bit more ahead of VR just because I could see the kind of the interaction happening with things. But I know one of my friends who basically he's tried to bring up his coding environment in a virtual reality headset, and he sees that as kind of like where the future of where he'd like to be, like working this kind of almost like Minority Report style, with his hands in the air.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? There's an Apple Vision Pro, there's a guy. I'll cut this bit if it's too much. The guy he goes to the toilet and he's got his Apple Vision Pro on, and then he shuts everything down and puts these mountain range behind him, like he's sitting on something thrown on the mountain. I thought that's what it's for. That's why they spent all that money developing it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, undoubtedly that's what it'll end up. That'll be the the key consumer sort of the app that launches everything right for these things is something nobody expects, right?
Yeah, not completely. It's really exciting and really interesting. Like as you say, augmented reality. There has been parts of it that have came out, went all right. It's not been fully developed, or even maybe people have kind of bought into it as much. But yeah, it could be really interesting. Sorry, this is about you, not me. So could you share a couple of book recommendations that have influenced you, either fiction or non-fiction?
I tend to read more non-fiction than fiction. I think as I've gotten older, I used to read more fiction, oddly enough, when I was younger. But I think I've always wanted to kind of continuously look at learning, and I love learning. So I always think of maybe, trying to look at non-fiction books. But I think if I was, there was always some, when I think back of fiction, there was a quote that I read. I read this one book, which I really quite liked, which was Vladimir Nabokov's, like, just collection of stories. I know he's written like novels and stuff like that, but I really liked, he had some short stories that I really enjoyed. And I just liked his method of writing and the way he was structuring some sentences. And at one point, there's a sentence that came out that really struck me, which was, he said something along the lines of, everything in the world is beautiful, but man only recognizes beauty if he sees it either seldom or from afar. And I think that's something that it really struck with me because it goes into the foundational principles of what I believe, which is that, that just because, something that occurs regularly or something like that, we maybe not notice the detail of it or appreciate it. And, or, that if we think it happens either frequently or we see it kind of on a regular basis. And sort of, even in my life, I always try to appreciate the small moments that you have, whether that's kind of at work or with family. I think that, it's not about, sort of I worry less about the big kind of, the big kind of moments and trying to create those as much as just going, sometimes it's just about like, bringing my wife a cup of tea in the morning, or saying hello to my kids, and then when I see them before they head off to school, taking a few moments to say that, something along those lines. So those kind of small moments I really look for. And same with that work. I try to sort of focus on some of the, what's the detail we need to get right. And I'm a big believer in one of the other actually books, nonfiction books that I was really influential was The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. And I read that and kind of got into a little bit of the habit phase prior to, I was following people like James Clear before he wrote his book on Atomic Habits. And, and just, I really sort of resonated with that idea of habits kind of build up what you do regularly, or sorry, habits kind of build up what you, the kind of person you are really at the end of the day. And so, and you can kind of almost build toward where you want to be by starting off small and building these kind of the habit and then growing the habit rather than trying to worry about creating these artificial goals. And I think that happens even at work too. There's lots of things I'm trying to do at work that I try to build in and sort of go, okay, well, what I'll do is I'll give myself, one of the things I always think I do, probably not as much as I'd like, is to just kind of plan out my time effectively, try to go from, I think sometimes I'm just too, you get too reactionary at work and you just want to fall into it, going to the next email, the next Slack message, the next fire, whereas taking a moment to sort of plan out what is my priority at the moment, and trying to spend a few moments for that and try to build onto that, I think is where, ideally I'd like to be. I'm not always there. So it takes discipline and, I'm still working on those aspects, but those are areas in terms of better habit formation around work. I think even as an organization, what are your organizational habits? I think if I talked a lot about metrics and reviewing data validation phase wise. And I always think about if you're an organization that believes that, what you do is you regularly have a meeting where you come and assess that. You look at your metrics as a team, as a part of a team, and you basically, we're going to do this on a regular basis because that is a good habit. We think that if we adopt, then people will more readily think in through that kind of methodology and that kind of paradigm, and therefore will be better off because of it. The only other book that I think, I've read quite a few books, and in terms of agile development or these kind of things, but I think one of the ones I really like, sort of getting into the product management space a little bit, is April Dunford's Obviously Awesome. And what I liked about that is it kind of really leads into the way she's very good, by the way. If you ever see her she's on YouTube, if you ever see her doing some videos on YouTube, and I think she's at Turkey Fest this year as well too, but but she's her the way she defined things, it just makes so much sense, right? She sort of you sort of listen to her and you go, that makes a lot of sense. And then you sort of go, it's one of these things where when you read it, you sort of go, oh yeah, okay, now that she's laid it out that way, it kind of makes sense. And she talks about is really just how you position your product in the market, but also because to me, what I couldn't get away from was what she was as she was talking about that, it makes you think about what are you saying about your product? How do you construct your product? You've got to know what one of her things is you've got to know what your alternatives are when you're selling the product. And especially obviously because I'm dealing with smaller companies now, a lot of times we're thinking about, well, the alternatives may not be something that is kind of an enterprise level version of X or, a big SaaS version of Y. And maybe that you're trying to get into a market where the alternative is a spreadsheet or the alternative is a student doing some work. And then understanding that it's not, if people will go in sometimes and go, well, there's no other companies doing what we're doing at the moment because this is such a new product in a new area that nobody's doing that. And then you're sort of going, well, is that really true? Because if nobody's doing it, is there any demand for it? Or are people doing it, but not through a technology piece, not through something like they said, they're just using a student to basically do some manual piece of work and you're going to try to automate that through some sort of tooling. Well, that's great, but then you need to know how do you construct a product that speaks to that. And again, thinking about the product development aspects, you're thinking about that could be everything from onboarding. If these people aren't used to using a kind of a web-based tool for that, how are you going to get them to understand how to use your product and use your product, which is maybe more technology focused? So those kind of aspects I think are really fascinating, and she really brings those out in the book really well about how to think about that. She's got, I think, a new book out about sales, and I forget the name of it. I have it on my desk, and I should go look it up, but I don't have it with me.
That's fine. I'll find it, and I'll put a link in when we launch it out. The next thing I would ask is, do your parents know what you do?
They kind of do. I think also with my career, because I have, it's family that have generally been sort of doing the same thing for quite a long time. And so because, I would move around from one organization to another, trying out different things and learning as I go and finding new areas to kind of explore and challenge myself. I think they'd always be like, so what are you doing now? What are you doing now? Which is always interesting. But I think my mother kind of, she knows I work in kind of technology, and it kind of, has some idea of what I do, but no, not to the, I think, not to the level of understanding of kind of what I do on a day-by-day basis. I think she thinks I probably, just program and write code and on a day-by-day basis. I think in the leadership aspects, I probably do less of that. I still get to code occasionally, which is good. I still get to code, especially my current role, but And, I still like doing that, but I think she probably thinks I probably do that more. My brother is a contractor. My brother is a contractor as well too. So all she ever knows, he's got a new contract. And then after, a few months, he's got another new contract. And then, so I think she tries to keep track of it that way. So aside from that, yeah, it was, and this goes back to the product aspects of it too, right? It's always nice when you can sort of go, here's what I do, and you can explain it.
You can kind of that tangible stuff, isn't it? Yeah, totally.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I ask you a final question then?
Yeah.
On dinner guests and any three, who they would be? I rhymed.
Yeah. You know what? I had a feeling I've heard some of your podcast before, so I had a feeling this question might come up, and I'd love to be even more prepared than I am for it because, and it's funny because I've heard somewhere on the internet, somebody asked like a bunch of adults this question. Maybe you've heard this before already, where they asked the adults, and the adults all said things like, Isaac Newton and and Einstein or these kind of things, Gandhi and stuff. And then when they asked the kids said, well, I'd want to sit down with my mom and my dad, my uncle, And so the parents, actually, we should have probably said that too. But so, I mean, there's certainly if I was to look at, I got 3 older brothers, it'd be great to sort of sit down and have dinner with them. That would probably be kind of a very family oriented kind of view, or certainly my own family. But, I certainly I have dinner with them quite a bit as it is. So that's quite fun, but it's always nice. Again, going back to that kind of frequency doesn't make it any less valuable. If I was to go, expand it into sort of the across history and time, obviously there'd be people. I kind of interested in, things like, I don't know, what would Barack Obama say? He's probably very popular in your responses to that, but I'd be interested because he probably has a real perspective on the time, which is quite interesting and novel. Aside from that, I'd probably like to find some people who are maybe who have a different perspective on things. Leonardo da Vinci was probably an interesting, real, thinker. He covered lots of both artistic and sort of he had some different kind of views on science and these kind of things as well too. Probably a really kind of interesting person to talk to. And geez, you know what? And maybe I'd throw in, April Dunford in that too, just because she's probably, just like I said, I really enjoy her videos, and sort of maybe she's more modern. Obviously, I could probably reach out to her and talk to her if I wanted to, hopefully, or run into her at Turing Fest or something maybe. But
it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast, Dwayne. Thank you so much for your time. Have you enjoyed it?
I have. It's been quite a lot of, interesting to think back on your answers, and go, it's one of these things I get the feeling I'm going to...
Well, that was our latest episode of Talking with Tech Leaders with Dwayne Pascal. Thanks so much, Dwayne, for your time. As always, if you're interested in having someone on the show that you think would be a great guest, please reach out to us via LinkedIn or my email address, which is michael.phair@be-it.co.uk. And as always, if you're looking to build or scale tech teams through managed services or through permanent and contract hire, then please do reach out to either BIT or BIT projects. Thank you.